Hi everyone, it's Rob Watson and this is a Decentered media vlog. It's number 7. And there's a couple of things that have come to my attention this week that I will share with you. And I'll put the links in both the blog and in the comment section underneath the video here. The first one is that there's a TV documentary that's going to be broadcast this weekend on Friday on the BBC News channel, which you can get via the iPlayer. And it's called The Village Loudspeaker, and it's about the history and the origin of local radio in the UK and the role that local radio has played in different communities and in different forms around the country. And it talks about the kind of spirit of what informs a sense of localness and a sense of identity, and what is it that kind of sustains an interest in local media, which I think is something that we've talked about before, and I've certainly talked about it in the Decentered Media podcast, about that kind of lessening of a sense of identity and association of our localness and our sense of place through our local media, which is becoming increasingly homogenised and corporately centrally controlled. And this brings me to another item, which is the government has announced a review of the future of radio. And the aim of the review is to think about how digital technology and changes in audience expectations, things like young people aren't listening to radio in the way that maybe older people listen to radio. And when you introduce things like smart speakers and 5G, there's a need to plan and change some ideas about the way that we manage the radio services and the radio industry. Unfortunately, in the material that's presented by the DCMS, by the John Whittingdale, the Minister for Media, is that there isn't any mention of community media in there, and that the review seems to be already decided as something which will take place between the BBC, Bauer, Global Radio, Arqiva, the transmission people, and the kind of the Society of Motor Manufacturers. Radio is a big part of car use, but there's no mention of anything about locally accountable, locally accessible, locally responsible forms of media organisation, which is what community radio is primarily licensed to do and is licensed for. So I would encourage a kind of participation. I'm certainly going to be thinking about what kind of input we can make to the policy review process through Decentered Media. So it'd be good to have some conversations and discussions about how that might play out, and what kind of progressive and forward-looking response we could think about. This ties in as well with a review that's been undertaken by Ofcom into the future of public service media, and particularly the perceptions that young people have about public service broadcasting. And they've got a project at the moment called "What is Small Screen? The Big Debate," and the aim is to try and get some information, some thoughts and some ideas from younger audiences about what they think public service broadcasting should be in the future. Now, we have to remember that those of us who were brought up on 3 or 4 channels on television, kind of regard public service broadcasting as it's a given. It's like, the water that fish swim in. But with the rise of Netflix and on-demand services and Apple TV and all the other kind of globalized streaming services, the role and the nature of public service broadcasting is kind of changing and needs to be rethought through. So they're going to consult, Ofcom are consulting, and they're going to give recommendations to government in the summer. So again, I'll put the link in the comments and on the blog, so if you want to get actively involved in that. Excuse me. The other thing that's come to my attention this week is a blog that was written by David Thomas of Social Value UK, who attended an event that was organised by Oxfam and the High Pay Centre, which is to look at the purpose beyond profit. So where does business go next in terms of developing its social responsibility, engagement, and what's its role within the social economy, and how can businesses, I think we can apply media in these terms, or we should apply media in these terms. They're kind of run as businesses, but what are the social gain objectives? What is the impact and the difference that we think a business makes above the profitability balance sheet? So it's really important that we think about and join up. It'd be interesting to see if the government, in its review of radio, joins up its thinking with from its commercial support to its social value remit. On the one hand, government is asking, has set a framework for local authorities and public bodies to think beyond the bottom line, but with our media regulation, it seems to be almost exclusively based around commercial considerations. And it'd be interesting to see what kind of input these review processes maybe bring up. The other thing that I saw this week, which is is very encouraging, is that Sir Lenny Henry, is going to be the leading a Centre for Media Diversity at Birmingham City University, which has a strong record in promoting access and diversity of access by training and educating people from non-traditional media backgrounds, so multi-ethnic, different classes of people, and different people with different pathways into education, to become viable candidates in the media jobs market. But there's still a considerable amount of work to be done on this. So it's good to see this. What I would ask, a kind of question of if anybody wants to again engage in this kind of conversation about this, is where do young people, or doesn't have to be young people, it could be anybody, where do people get their experience of engaging in media? Where do people learn, and where do people define and model practices and get their media literacies and their skills outside of the already established media industries? And if all we're doing is training people to go and work in those media industries and not develop an alternative ecosystem of access and engagement outside of those very narrow established commercial business imperatives that our media is driven by, how do we explore and explain media content to a generation of people who don't see themselves in this, or only see a very specific, very kind of overly commercialized approach to media? So it's really welcome to see a kind of initiative that is, and Lenny Henry's been a long-term champion of diversity in British media. This connects me to the next item, which last week we did a podcast with Andy Green and Russell Todd for the Grow Social Capital campaign, and Andy has written and Russell have written a blog, an article, excuse me, about how we engage volunteers within social sector organisations, charities, community groups, without necessarily just thinking that that the standard approach is to look for volunteers. But what do you do with volunteers? Are they just working for nothing? Are they just turning up to kind of stand around? There's a kind of a deflation, if you like, about the way that we think about using volunteers. And what Andy and Russell argue for is that we need to think about volunteering in a different way. We need to think about it as something which is a process of enhancing and extending people's social capital, and that it can broaden your networks, and that it can give you views and experiences through life which you would not normally gain. So Andy and Russell call social capital the oxygen that is within communities, and some communities have more social capital than others. And their argument is that it's a relationship, it's a journey about engaging in relationships and how we recognise one another and what we learn from one another. As being the lifeblood of our, not what we get out of somebody, not just what we can charge for them or use them for, which is a kind of standard way of thinking about we activated volunteers and we got them to do X, Y, and Z. No, this is about a different framework, which is about establishing long-term relationships of mutual benefit and mutual concern. And there's some models that they point to in the article, which again I'll put the links for underneath this blog. The last thing I'll draw your attention to is a report that came out from the Young Foundation and Big Society Capital, which is called Nothing About Us Without Us, Lived Experience, Insight and Social Investment. And it is really nice, really good report, in the sense that what it argues for is that we shouldn't be making decisions about social investment without considering people's lived experience. Now, what does that mean? That means that the research that takes place that informs decision making, whether it's economic decision making, social policy decision making, resource management, resource planning, all those kind of things, have to be grounded in evidence which is drawn from people's experience, not just supposed or imagined or kind of, our prejudices tell us this, or indeed a research that was conducted a few years ago, because things change and things develop and things can be positively and negatively influential, which mean that we don't get uptake in terms of social development. So it's kind of a direct way. Now, that for me, to round these things together, what links them is that community media is primarily about enabling people to express their themselves and to talk about the experience that they have. So it would be, if we join these things up, really useful to have a model of community media which could draw on people's direct experience, allow people to express and be creative and responsible about the way that they communicate and what they communicate, which would enhance diversity and which would nurture future economic growth. So if you've got any comments, it'd be really great to join in with a conversation. The comments below are always available, unless you're selling me something and you want me to increase my SEO capability on my website or something like that. So like it, thumbs up, thumbs down, and keep listening to the Decentered Media podcasts. We've got me and John Costa at the Doc Media Centre. We've got a few more lined up in the coming weeks, and keep looking out for things that we share on Twitter via Twitter, which is @DecenteredMedia, or Instagram, which is @DecenteredMedia. But until next time, thank you very much.